Before the arrival of European and American settlers, the Yokuts people inhabited a vast and bountiful territory. This area, primarily encompassing the San Joaquin Valley of California, was rich in natural resources. Numerous rivers, including the San Joaquin, Kings, and Kern, snaked through the valley, providing ample water and supporting a diverse ecosystem. The Yokuts lived in numerous independent village groups, each with its own distinct territory and leadership. Their world was one of familiarity, where generations had thrived by understanding and respecting the rhythms of the land. They had developed sophisticated methods for managing these resources, ensuring their sustainability for future generations. This deep connection to their environment was central to their culture and way of life, shaping their beliefs, social structures, and daily activities for centuries. The Yokut society was intricately organized. They were skilled hunters, fishers, and gatherers. Acorns, a staple food, were harvested from the abundant oak trees and processed through laborious yet effective techniques. They hunted deer, elk, and smaller game, and fished for salmon and other aquatic life in the valley's waterways. Their villages were often located along rivers or near reliable water sources, facilitating access to these critical resources. Trade networks connected different Yokuts groups and extended to neighboring tribes, allowing for the exchange of goods, ideas, and cultural practices. This interconnectedness fostered a vibrant regional culture even amidst the political autonomy of individual villages. Their spiritual beliefs were deeply intertwined with the natural world, with ceremonies and stories reflecting their reverence for the land and its creatures. The period leading up to 1840 saw the beginnings of change, though the full force of disruption was yet to come. Spanish missionaries and Mexican rancheros had made incursions into the coastal regions of California, and their influence, along with introduced diseases, began to indirectly affect some Yokuts communities bordering these areas. However, the core of Yokuts territory in the central and southern San Joaquin Valley remained largely under their control. Direct contact with non-native people was sporadic for many groups. The primary impact during these earlier decades was often the unseen spread of European diseases, which could decimate populations without direct sustained contact, weakening communities before larger waves of settlers arrived. The vastness of their domain still provided a buffer against the changes occurring elsewhere in California. As the 1840s progressed, the political landscape of California grew increasingly unstable. Mexico's hold on its northern territories was weakening. An increasing number of American and European trappers, traders, and adventurers began to venture into the interior, including parts of Yokuts land. These early encounters, while not yet representing a full-scale invasion, signaled a growing external pressure. The reports sent back by these explorers often highlighted the fertile lands and potential resources of the San Joaquin Valley, further fueling interest from outsiders. For the Yokuts, these were ominous signs of the profound transformations that were rapidly approaching, threatening their ancestral way of life and their very existence on the land they had always known. The Mexican-American War, which raged from 1846 to 1848, fundamentally altered the destiny of California and its indigenous inhabitants, including the Yokuts. With the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, Mexico ceded California and other vast territories to the United States. This transfer of sovereignty occurred without any consultation or consideration for the native peoples who had lived on these lands for millennia. Suddenly, the Yokuts found themselves under a new, distant, and often hostile governing power. The new American authorities generally did not recognize indigenous land titles or rights in the same way, if at all, as the previous Spanish or Mexican systems, which themselves were often inadequate. This legal vacuum and shift in power created an environment ripe for exploitation and violence against native communities. During the Mexican-American War, Robert F. Stockton played a significant role as a U.S. Navy Commodore and, for a period, as military governor of California. His actions were instrumental in securing American control over the territory. Stockton's administration focused on establishing U.S. authority and quelling any resistance, whether from Californios or native groups. While his direct interactions with the Yokuts specifically might have been limited, his broader policies and the military presence he commanded set a precedent for American dominance. The establishment of U.S. military posts and the assertion of American law began to erode the autonomy of indigenous nations like the Yokuts. This period marked the beginning of a more aggressive phase of American expansion into the interior of California, with profound consequences for all native inhabitants. Captain Charles Weber, a German immigrant who arrived in California in the early 1840s, became a key figure in the northern San Joaquin Valley, an area traditionally inhabited by Yokuts people. In 1847, Weber founded the settlement of Tullaburg, which he later renamed Stockton in honor of Commodore Stockton. Weber acquired a massive land grant, the Campo de los Franceses, which encompassed significant Yokuts territories. He engaged in both conflict and negotiation with local native groups, but his primary aim was to develop his holdings and attract settlers. His presence and the growth of Stockton represented a direct encroachment on Yokuts' land and resources, leading to increased friction and displacement of the original inhabitants as more settlers were drawn to the agricultural potential of the region that Weber actively promoted. The situation for native Californians, including the Yokuts, deteriorated sharply with the rise of Peter Burnett, who became the first American civilian governor of California in December 1849. Burnett was openly hostile towards Native Americans. In his addresses to the state legislature, he infamously declared that a war of extermination will continue to be waged between the races until the Indian race becomes extinct. He argued that it was beyond the power or wisdom of man to avert this outcome. Burnett's rhetoric was not mere political posturing. It translated into official state policy. He advocated for and signed into law measures that funded private militias to attack and kill native people, effectively sanctioning genocide and setting a horrific tone for state Indian relations. The discovery of gold at Sutter's Mill in January 1848 unleashed an unprecedented wave of migration to California, an event that became known as the Gold Rush. Within a short period, hundreds of thousands of gold seekers, predominantly young men from the eastern United States and around the world, flooded into the Sierra Nevada foothills and the rivers that flowed into the San Joaquin Valley, the heart of Yokuts territory. This massive and sudden influx of people completely overwhelmed the existing native populations. The Yokuts, who had lived in relative isolation, were suddenly confronted by an army of intruders driven by an insatiable hunger for gold. Their ancestral lands, once quiet and managed according to their traditions, became overnight targets for exploitation and settlement by the newcomers. The methods used by gold miners were devastating to the Yokuts' environment and their way of life. Hydraulic mining, sluicing, and river dredging tore apart landscapes, choked rivers with sediment, and destroyed fish spawning grounds. Forests were cut down for timber to build flumes, cabins, and support mine shafts. Game animals, crucial for Yokut subsistence, were hunted to near extinction by the miners for food. Acorn groves, a primary food source for the Yokuts, were often destroyed or made inaccessible. The pollution of rivers with mining debris and later mercury poisoned the water sources that both people and wildlife depended upon. This rapid and catastrophic environmental destruction directly translated into starvation and displacement for countless Yokuts families whose traditional food systems collapsed under the onslaught. The gold rush was not only an environmental disaster for the Yokuts, but also a period of extreme violence. Many of the miners were armed, lawless, and held deeply racist views towards Native Americans, seeing them as obstacles to their quest for wealth. Clashes over land, resources, and alleged thefts often escalated into massacres of Yokuts' men, women, and children. Unprovoked attacks on Yokuts' villages became commonplace. There was virtually no legal recourse for the Yokuts. The nascent Californian legal system was heavily biased in favor of the white settlers and miners. Native testimony was often inadmissible in court, and the killing of an Indian was rarely treated as a crime. This impunity emboldened perpetrators and created a climate of terror for Native communities. Under Governor Burnett's leadership, the California state legislature formalized policies that encouraged the killing of Native Americans. Laws were passed authorizing the formation and funding of volunteer militias whose explicit purpose was to chastise or subdue Indian populations. The state government allocated substantial sums, eventually totaling over $1 million, to reimburse these militias for their expenses. Furthermore, a system of bounties was effectively implemented in some regions, paying individuals for Native American scalps or heads. These state-sanctioned actions transformed localized violence into a more systematic campaign of extermination. The state itself was now actively promoting and financing the murder of its indigenous peoples, including the Yokuts, in the name of progress and settler expansion. The combined effects of the gold rush, state-sponsored violence, and rampant disease led to a catastrophic decline in the Yokuts' population. By the latter half of the 19th century, their numbers had been drastically reduced from pre-contact estimates that ran into the tens of thousands. Entire villages were wiped out, either through direct massacres or through starvation and disease that followed the destruction of their environment and food sources. Survivors were often forced to flee their ancestral homes, seeking refuge in more remote areas or attempting to attach themselves to the fringes of settler society in subservient roles. The scale of death and displacement was immense, constituting a genocide that forever altered the demographic landscape of the San Joaquin Valley. The period from the 1850s through the 1870s is sometimes referred to as the California Indian Wars. For the Yokuts, these were not wars in the conventional sense of conflict between two comparable military powers. Instead, they were a series of desperate, often uncoordinated acts of resistance against overwhelming force, interspersed with brutal campaigns of extermination waged by U.S. Army troops, state militias, and vigilante groups. Treaties negotiated with some Yokuts groups in the early 1850s, which might have reserved some lands for them, were never ratified by the U.S. Senate, leaving them legally landless in the eyes of the American government. Any resistance was met with disproportionate retribution, further diminishing their ability to protect themselves or their remaining lands. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the surviving Yokuts people were largely confined to a few small, often barren and inadequate parcels of land known as rancherias or reservations. These were typically located on marginal lands that white settlers did not want. The federal government's policy aimed at assimilation, further eroding Yokuts' culture, language, and traditional governance structures. Children were often forcibly sent to government-run boarding schools where they were punished for speaking their native languages or practicing their customs. The loss of their vast ancestral territory meant the loss of their economic independence and the severing of deep spiritual connections to specific sacred sites and landscapes which were central to their identity. By 1920, the Yokuts' homeland, once a thriving expanse supporting a large and complex society, had been almost entirely transformed into agricultural fields, towns, and cities dominated by a new population. The Yokuts people themselves were a dispossessed minority in their own land, struggling for survival and recognition. The violence, land theft, and cultural destruction they endured between 1840 and 1920 left an indelible mark. Despite these immense hardships and the profound trauma inflicted upon them, the Yokuts people persisted. Survivors carried forward their cultural knowledge, languages, and traditions, adapting to new and challenging circumstances while continuing to assert their identity and fight for justice and the reclamation of their heritage in the decades that followed. If you found this story important, please like, subscribe, and share this video to help spread awareness. And don't forget to support the channel by following Chopin_game_209 for more untold histories and powerful stories.